Alright, this is the second video for using the quadratic formula to solve equations. And on this first example here, I want to add the 9x squared and subtract 4x. So we can set this equal to 0. Remember, it has to be in this form, standard form, before we start with the formula. Identify A, B, and C. Right, because that's what we need to substitute into the quadratic formula. And then I like to find the b squared minus 4ac first. So we square negative 4 minus 4 times 9 times 2. And that's going to be 16 minus 72, which happens to be negative 56. All right, and then we're going to substitute everything into the actual formula. So x equals the opposite of b would be a positive 4. That's the square root of negative 56 for my discriminant, and then it is 2 times 9. 2 times a would be 2 times 9 for our denominator. Now, negative 56 will simplify. Let's see, so that's going to be negative 1 times 4 times 14. 14, 20, yeah, okay, I had to think about that for a second. And then that's 4 plus or minus 2i times the square root of 14 over 18. And then we're going to factor out a 2 in our numerator. Well, I guess technically numerator and denominator. And then that would leave me with this, right? I just take 4 divided by 2 and 2i divided by 2. 2i radical 14 divided by 2. This is 2 times 9. And then we can remove the 2, right, because that's in common. And our solution then is 2 plus or minus I radical 14 over 9. Okay, and that's solved. Now, you can see there's a lot to do here. You had to simplify negative 56. You had to factor out a common factor. Always be on the lookout for that. A common mistake on this is that students want to take a 2 from the 4 and the 18, but they leave the 2i. Remember, you can only simplify if you can factor out the same term, right, the same constant from every single part of this. All right. So once again, before you would use the quadratic formula, you would clear these fractions. And we would clear the fractions by multiplying by 8 on both sides, right? So that's going to leave me with a 1x squared plus 8x plus 2 goes into 8 4 times, and then we multiply by 5 to get 20. Let's identify A, B, and C. And then calculate the b squared minus 4ac. So that's going to be 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20, which is 64 minus 80. And then that gives us negative 16. All right, so now we go to the formula and we substitute in everything that we know. The opposite of b is going to make that a negative 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 over 2 times a, which is 1. Then we simplify the negative 16 under the radical, which is 4i. And then you can see that everything's divisible by 2. All right, so if I take a 2 out, that's negative 4 plus or minus 2i over 2, right? 2 is my common factor. So my solution then is negative 4 plus or minus 2i. And that's solved. All right, we just have a couple more. All right, so we're going to distribute the y. So that's 3y squared plus 8y, and then subtract 5. Identify a, b, and c. Now, you guys may think it's silly to always identify the a, b, and c. I mainly do this to try to help you make sure that you don't miss your signs, because it is just common for students to write down, for instance, 5 and put 5 into the formula and not negative 5. So let's be sure that we identify each of our terms, or our a, b, and c, and the signs of those. All right, so calculate b squared minus 4ac, the discriminant, right? That's what also called the discriminant. Being careful with our signs. So on this one, we're going to have 64, and that's going to be plus, right? Because I have a negative times a negative, and that's 12 times 5, which is 60. So this is going to be 124. Okay, and so now we put everything into the formula. Y equals the opposite of b would make that a negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 124 over 2 times a, and a is 3. All right, and then we simplify. So 124, I know it's divisible by 4, so it's 124, yeah, so that is 4 times 31. All right, so negative 8 plus or minus 2 radical 31 over 6. I'm hoping that, as we've worked through this, you've started to recognize when we have a common factor, right? All of these are divisible by 2, negative 8, 2 radical 31, and 6. So technically we are factoring out a 2. And remember, factoring out just means you're dividing by 2. Everything's divided by 2. And then we can remove the common factor of 2. And my solution will be negative 4 plus or minus square root of 31 over 3. Now, even if I'm not saying that you have to show every single step like I show, but be careful not to take too many shortcuts and then end up messing something up. Okay, so here is our last example. There are definitely some of these like this in the book, because that's where my examples come from. So first we have to simplify this equation. That will be 7p squared minus 14p plus 2p plus 8, and I'm going to subtract the 3, right? And then combine like terms. So that's going to be negative 12p plus 5 for our equation once we've got it all simplified and ready to go. Identify a, b, and c. Calculate b squared minus 4ac. So negative 12 squared minus 4 times 7 times 5. And then that's going to be 144 minus, that's going to be a 140, which is just 4. Okay. Now I know right away that because I'm going to take the square root of 4 when I get to the formula, this is an equation that would have factored. So you could have actually factored. At some point, you could be given the choice, solve this equation, and you get to decide what method you're going to use. And so checking factoring might be wise, because quite honestly, factoring's quicker than, this method, for instance. Also, sometimes completing the square would be sufficient, but I wouldn't on this one if I had the choice, because you would have to divide everything by 7 to begin with. All right, so into the formula. All right, the opposite of b would be a positive 12. That's plus or minus the square root of 4. And 2 times a would be 2 times 7. So 12 plus or minus 2, right? The square root of 4 is 2 over 14. So my two solutions are going to be 12 minus 2 over 14, 12 plus 2 over 14, and so 10 fourteenths, that's the first one, right? 10 over 14 is going to be 5 over 7, and then 14, right? 12 plus 2 is 14 over 14 is 1. So getting rational answers means that this would have factored. That's another way that you know, even if you don't recognize it before you get to this last part where you have solved. All right, well, that's it for this lesson.